Next part of our agenda is we're taking yet another turn in the road and having some fun with it, but we have a relatively new program that Trade Team PEI has introduced. I think we introduced it at this forum last year, and it deals with the formation of various business clusters to pursue opportunities together as opposed to independently of one another. So far, we've had a lot of great discussions with businesses on Prince Edward Island. I think we've got some clusters starting to form. I think we have more work to do in that arena. We're very fortunate to have with us this afternoon as part of our program an individual that has extensive experience in working in the Newfoundland community in forming clusters. So from one island to another, we're sharing our thoughts. Dennis actually works for the government of Newfoundland in a different capacity than what we do, so he's not stepping on his own toes, if you will. He's very well educated, he's very well connected, and he has lots of great experience. So I think we can share his bio. I'm not going to get into it because it would take me about 10 minutes to read all of it. Instead, I'm just going to call Dennis to the microphone and have him share with you their experience on forming clusters.
Well, thank you very much, Lee, for your kind introduction and for that applause. Actually, and I haven't even really said anything yet, so now I'll demand nothing less than a standing ovation by the time I'm done. As Lee indicated, I am from Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm here today in a bit of a different capacity, not my day-to-day work with the provincial government, which these days involves labor market development. I'm here to talk about my former life, in fact. I was very fortunate to become, I guess, the founding executive director of Oceans Advance, which is the Ocean Technology Cluster Initiative in St. John's, and it was one of 10 clustering initiatives that was initiated by the National Research Council across the country. In Vancouver, there was fuel cells, nanotechnology, and largely based around Edmonton. And here, of course, in Prince Edward Island, bioscience, and I think the work that Rory Francis has done around clustering would be very similar to some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So I guess what I really came to realize in my recent visits to Prince Edward Island is truly how great the hospitality is here in this province. The tourism industry in particular is really the gold standard in the country. I'm not sure if you're aware or not, but we've been trying to catch up to Prince Edward Island in Newfoundland and Labrador and launched a very aggressive tourism campaign that highlights the rugged beauty of the province. It's really different, and I think the tagline, or one of the taglines, is as about as far away from Disney World as you can get. So it's a different tourism product. And I'm really glad they didn't go with the initial tagline, which was going to be Newfoundland and Labrador, not as far as Greenland. So I was thinking about the various trips I've made here in preparation for today's event, and I've probably been here a dozen times. Each time has been phenomenal, mostly for work, although a few vacations were thrown in between. And actually on the flight yesterday, I started to think about my very first visit to Prince Edward Island. And I think I was 12 years old. It was a family vacation. We went to Cavendish with some cousins and family. And I will admit to you in this room here today during that visit, I took my first big step toward manhood on that visit. Now, it's not what you might be thinking. It's the very first time I actually used deodorant. And the reason I remember that is because I actually bought it as well with my brother. We went to a local drugstore in Cavendish, and wanting to be manly, I bought, with my vacation money, Brute 33, I think it was. And of course, my brother, who was 10 at the time, convinced me that I also needed to buy aftershave. So I ended up buying Old Spice aftershave. And of course, I spent the week lathered up in Old Spice, thinking that this was going to be a big hit with the girls down on the beach. So that was my first lesson in false advertising. So not only did I not attract any of the girls, I think my family pretty much avoided me for that whole week as well. So anyway, I digress. So I'm here to talk about clustering, and in our province, I guess the key showcase cluster has been ocean technology. And when I'm talking about clustering, really, if I were to put it into simple terms, what it's all about, in my opinion, is collaboration and alignment. This is something that we do all the time. All the discussions that we've had today really center on collaboration and alignment. And how do you take competitive advantage, locational advantage, and turn the assets that you have in a region into an advantage that really helps sometimes competing firms who also happen to cooperate under the framework of a cluster, and then ensure that you're better positioning and branding your location for greater success in global markets. So in St. John's, it's all about ocean technology. And the reasons for that are many, but to kind of sum up, the ocean is very important, as it would be here in Prince Edward Island as well. But it has shaped the culture and history of Newfoundland and Labrador for more than 500 years. We're in a strategic geographic location in the North Atlantic. We have a range of primary industries, whether it's fisheries, aquaculture, offshore oil, marine transportation, and so on, that are dependent on understanding the ocean and developing technologies and innovations that allow the community, the businesses that form the economy to exploit those industries, primary industries, and create value-added opportunity through technology development. There's also tremendous R&D infrastructure in place, which I'll mention in a second, and a strong concentration of about 50 or so ocean technology firms that have evolved in, say, the last 30 years. And key to, I think, some of the support that this cluster has had over that period of time has been a very supportive environment, really at the municipal, provincial, and federal level. And it's been quite extraordinary to see some of the cooperation that has taken place. As well, you have key economic drivers. The big one in Newfoundland and Labrador, of course, would be offshore oil and gas, commercial fisheries, seafood processing, aquaculture, transportation, the impacts of climate change, environmental conservation, recreation and tourism. These are all drivers that are fueling what we call the so-called blue economy or the ocean economy, with a particular focus on applications for the oil and gas industry. And of course, in our province, the oil and gas sector is one of the biggest players. Right now, if you can believe it, our GDP is largely dependent on oil. That's having a lot of baskets in one, a lot of eggs in one basket, rather. But in that, while it's brought newfound wealth to the province, it's also brought many opportunities, and opportunities to develop technologies that will allow companies to continue exporting for decades and decades to come, long after the oil gets depleted. Some of the infrastructure, I'll just show you quickly a few shots of some of the institutional infrastructure we had. This is a shot of the full mission ship bridge simulator at the Marine Institute, which does contract work all around the world for companies, governments, institutions that need to do simulation activities related to the marine sector. There's strong capacity in building remotely operated vehicles or underwater vehicles, and this is a shot of the flume tank at the Marine Institute, another one of the infrastructure pieces that was put in place in the mid to late 1980s with funds that came out of the Offshore Development Fund, which was a $300 million fund that came from the federal government that allowed these significant investments. And they were investments at a time when there was no immediate political payoff. The fruit of those investments is really only starting to be generated in the last 10 years or so. And these investments at the time were very costly, very expensive, and in some ways a little bit controversial, because we're trying to see, or at the time, trying to understand how investments in R&D would ultimately pay off in economic activity, and that is starting to happen. Of course, there's very strong capacity in operating in ice-prone waters and harsh environments, and that was largely driven by the exploration activities that happened in the province over the course of the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that spun off to other kinds of expertise, such as UAVs, which have marine security applications, and so on. I just wanted to highlight one of the world-class researchers that has a chair in underwater vehicles at Memorial University, Ralph Bachmeier. And there are really perhaps close to 200 individuals of Ralph's caliber that I could put up here on slides and tell you a little bit about. But now that I work in labor market development, I've been exposed to all the pressures of finding people for the mega projects that are happening in Newfoundland and Labrador. Muskrat Falls is one, the hydro development, the new Hebron offshore development that's taking place. These are very labor-intensive projects where we're having a great deal of difficulty filling positions, particularly in key trades, whether it's welding or it could be other types of mechanical related work. But thinking back on my involvement with the cluster, I think an area that we really need to continue to focus on is, in addition to trying to find the labor supply for large-scale projects, we would be greatly advantaged by attracting another 5 or 6 or 10 Ralph Bachmeiers, because they bring research money, they bring their research teams with them, and it continues to fuel the development of well-trained experts in the area. In this case, it's ocean technology, but here in Prince Edward Island, it could very well be bioscience related or aerospace or any number of sectors that are priorities here in the province. So simply put, the mission we had in Newfoundland and Labrador was to put the province on the map. And in doing so, we had very simply some key aspects to building that cluster: industry leadership, enhancing research infrastructure, training good experts in that field who could go out into the world and make their name, and ideally be ambassadors for the technologies that we're developing, homegrown technologies now that are sold around the world. Government policy and funding was also critical to the development of the cluster. We had to ensure that fledgling startups that are just out of the gates had a secure environment in which to launch their products and try to compete globally. And that's a very difficult process to go through, as I'm sure many in this room would understand and have experience in, particularly when you're not near or close to those big international markets. And in Newfoundland, while we have geographic competitive advantages in a lot of ways, close to Europe, different time zones the time zone is helpful for doing business in Europe and so on. In terms of logistics and shipping, it can be a very difficult and challenging geographic location from which to do business. I mentioned earlier the NRC cluster development model, of which the bioscience sector here on the island was a part of. And again, in our experience, we've had a strong cluster emerge through various waves. We've had companies that have formed, fell apart, restructured, were bought out. So what formed in, say, the early to mid-90s is quite different than the firms that we have in place now. But what we've seen is that a lot of the people are the same. They move from company to company and bring their expertise to new opportunities as it arises. I'd be remiss if I didn't have a word here today about Michael Porter, who is in many ways the international cluster guru. You may be familiar with some of his work. I just put up a couple of texts there that you may want to investigate at some point in time, but Michael Porter is really someone who's brought great attention to local competitive advantage, and a lot of strategy work and research has been at the macroeconomic level, and Peter gave a brilliant talk this morning about those national and provincial economic indicators that create the environment for which we export. Then, of course, there's all kinds of studies and work on company strategy, and that is more internal to a firm in how they will conquer international markets. But it was really Porter who decided to focus on location and why would a cluster form in a certain area? What are the natural endowments or those natural attributes? Why would you do business in Prince Edward Island in aerospace? There has to be a reason that that cluster has emerged over a period of time, given highly qualified people, giving investments by government. It could be legacy issues from having presence of the Canadian Air Force, whatever it may be. And his work, in his work, rather, he defines a cluster as a geographically proximate group of interconnected companies that are associated institutions in a given field, linked by commonalities and complementarities. He also has done work on developing cluster modeling and competitiveness modeling. And one thing that we looked at in the early days of developing the Oceans Advanced Cluster, which I was part of, is where would we fit into a model such as this? And if you look at the diagram that's laid out there, at the center of a cluster you have firm rivalry, and you have investments that are made on a firm basis to really compete globally. But all of that is happening where there are certain demand conditions. You have a core group of customers or clients that may be local or national or international, and customers wanting to have whatever product you're starting to sell. At the same time, your factor inputs or natural attributes or endowments are the skilled people you have. It could be natural resources. In tourism, it's the location. You're offering the culture. You're offering so many different opportunities that are right here on your doorstep. And finally, with related and supported industries, that's really about the so-called institutions for collaboration, or IFCs rather. And Oceans Advanced was one of those groups. So would the PEI BioAlliance be another, or the Chamber of Commerce. These are networking groups that are formed really to promote the industry, to drive industry with government policy, advocating for government policy, and so on. And that's something that we've been able to have quite a great experience with. I just put up this slide because I was very fortunate to actually study with Porter several years ago. So this is kind of my little Forrest Gump moment where I'm there with somebody quite famous, and it was really hard to believe. This is our end of course, end of term reception that he held in his office, and the people I was able to meet in the Institute for Competitiveness at Harvard Business School were incredible. I found myself just in a bit of a dreamlike state saying, how did I get here? And it's a long, complicated story, so I won't get into it, but it was the experience of a lifetime, and that legacy now still holds within me. But the funny thing is, I really did my cluster work before I ended up doing this study, so now I'm reflecting back on things we did and not even realize that we were going down Porter's model and some others really by coincidence in some ways, but it's something that I'm very grateful I had the opportunity to do. Another cluster expert is someone who's been here to Prince Edward Island before, and he's also been to Newfoundland and Labrador, and his name is Efor Foulkes-Williams. He operates Cluster Navigators out of Nelson, New Zealand. Efor is a great guy. I had the privilege of meeting him about 10 or 12 years ago, and he travels the world, and I think he's due to come back to Prince Edward Island in November. If he does offer a workshop and you haven't had the opportunity to experience, I highly recommend it. I found a quote from Efor that really helps put it all into perspective. It's strong clusters that create wealth, high quality jobs, export income for communities, and creates new businesses. But he's very clear in talking about not trying to build that new cluster or design a cluster when you really don't have the foundation to do so. It's more about focusing on what we already have. And coming back to the ocean technology sector, it's just a natural for the St. John's region to start developing opportunities that rely on the strengths that are already there. Very quickly, I'll mention that we've seen tremendous growth, not in the number of companies, because there's been a lot of acquisitions. Some companies die on the vine, other new ones start up, some are incorporated into other larger entities. But if you look at the growth, sales revenue alone has increased considerably. And the most current numbers I could find was from 2010. There's work being done now on a more current update to that profile, but I expect that the level of activity in the sector now is probably pushing $1 billion. And that is from technology sales, from the value-added, knowledge-based research that's done in the province. So the cluster itself has, I think about 5 years ago, set out a very audacious goal, and that was to reach $1 billion industry by the year 2015, which we're now creeping up on. And I think they're probably going to hit that target. As well, there's a significant number of people that are employed in that sector. It's helping to diversify the economy in the province. We've had a lot of non-commercial partners that are critical to cluster development, as you would have here in Prince Edward Island as well. The government agencies, research and development funders, educational institutions, industry associations have one way or another contributed to the environment now where it's easier to do business in this sector. We're all out trying to sell the vision for Newfoundland and Labrador, and St. John's in particular, as the location of choice for ocean technology development. And that wasn't easy. There's a lot of friction, and often people felt that their toes were being stepped on. There were a lot of growing pains during this process. But looking back on it now, with the lens I have now, I can honestly say that there were tremendous opportunities that eventually people started to recognize, and a lot of those barriers came down as success started to breed more success. We also have many international partners, and one in particular is our partnership with the institutions, governments, and companies in Ireland. We have a natural affinity. There are cultural ties with Ireland. Ireland, for companies in Newfoundland and Labrador, is a gateway to the European Union, just as in the reverse direction, Newfoundland and Labrador is a gateway to North America. And we've had multiple collaborations in the ocean technology field around oil and gas applications. There's a lot more exploration happening off the coast of Ireland now. They're looking to the experts that now have built their businesses and their credentials in St. John's, largely in the St. John's region. There's ocean observing technologies that are being developed jointly, and that is just one example. There are many others. There are ocean clusters in Victoria, in British Columbia, Rimouski in Quebec, in Halifax, of course, San Diego, Norway, and these cluster organizations have started to talk to each other. And when you can find a region that has complementary technologies or a knowledge base or research and marry those together, your chances of creating success in international markets together are much greater. So we're seeing that start to happen now. It's just a phenomenal story. Doesn't mean they don't compete, because yes, they certainly do compete, and there are different aspects of the region the companies are involved in St. John's versus the ones in Victoria, but they've somehow started to figure out that together they can become stronger, even though they're located very, very far apart. Just to mention too now, and this has applications beyond cluster development itself, but one thing, again, in kind of casting my eyes back on the formation of the cluster itself, is that it really came down to leadership. And I've been fortunate in that experience in learning cluster development with Michael Porter, that I've also gotten exposed to some leadership experts at the Kennedy School of Government, and two of them in particular are Dean Williams and Ron Heifetz. And I'd strongly recommend any of the texts you see outlined there on the slide, because both Ron and his protege, Dean, have developed a leadership, or a view of leadership rather, that kind of turns things on its head a bit. They talk about adaptive leadership, and they view it as not a noun. You are not a leader. It's actually a verb. You exercise leadership. And the true test of leadership is convincing those around you of what the realities are. And I guess looking back again on my history with cluster development, we were trying to do that, but we didn't always have the right guide map in doing it. We stumbled a bit, we would pick up again and then try and move on. But I think if I were going to leave some advice to you, I would recommend checking out either one of those individuals and some of their work around leadership. And that's really what will fuel cluster development going forward in Prince Edward Island, is how can you identify those champions that are going to take on the leadership or exercise the leadership that you need to make a difference and get people to change. I don't think people are necessarily against change and resist change. They really resist loss. And when you start to talk about people that have to now work together under the guise of a cluster, they're fearful in some cases that they're going to lose. And they may lose market share, they may lose people who now will go from one company to another. But that's part of the risk you have to take. And you have to exercise that leadership that will allow people to come together in a way that they're cooperating but still competing. And it's kind of a fine line to walk. Okay, so all that said, I'm going to tell you a very quick story to close, and that is a story of the biggest lesson I've ever learned about collaboration and alignment. It has nothing to do with cluster development and everything to do with my wedding day. So you're trying to think, now how is he going to join that together? But anyway, I, like many men, and I'm going to sound very stereotypical, but when my wife Jill and I got married, and that's a picture of us the day before our wedding, actually, not the day of. Like many men, I was kind of along for the ride. Once we decided to get married, my wife and her mother and family and cousins and friends, they took over. They started to plan our wedding with what I would say was military precision. So I offered, what can I do to help out? And I was largely left on the sidelines. I think her advice was, just show up on time, don't be too hungover, and wear the suit I picked out for you. So anyway, as our wedding day was approaching, and by the way, we got married on George Street. There is a church on the west side of George Street, so not where all the bars are, but yes, technically I did get married on George Street. And when the day was approaching, I had it in my mind I wanted to do something really special, something that she would never forget for the rest of her life. And I couldn't really think of what that was going to be. I thought, well, I could get her jewelry and flowers, and I ended up doing that anyway. But as the wedding was being planned and, we were picking out my wedding suit and this tie, this very expensive silk tie that I'm sure was more expensive than all the ties I already had in my closet. And all these activities were happening, and I felt, I'm not really contributing, but I want to make sure that she doesn't forget this day. So I thought about it, and I was getting a little bit nervous as the day drew near. Finally, it came to me. I am going to knock her socks off, but it's going to be in what I say, not in what I give her. So we go to the church, we have our wedding, we are announced to everyone as we're now married. We're walking down the aisle, everyone's clapping and cheering, and I have to say it was surreal. It was the happiest moment of my life. I was on cloud nine. We're walking out toward the end of the church, getting ready to greet everyone coming down. And here was my plan I had formulated for a couple of days in my head, and I recited it over and over and over. And Jill was there. We were by the door of the church, and I took her hands. I looked into her eyes, and I said, I have finally discovered the meaning of true love. True love is when you meet that one person, when every day is like the first day you ever met and the last day you'll ever see each other again. And that's exactly how I feel about you. And she looked back at me and said, you have a spot on your tie. We weren't exactly in alignment. So anyway, that's one more final important point, and that is thank you. Appreciate your attention.